Hi everyone, and welcome to NEBA. As he mentioned, my name is Catherine Baer. I'm a past president, and I am here to introduce this month's speaker, who happens to be my boss, and the president of Government Accountability Institute. By the way, Rocky, it's never a good idea to ask an employee to introduce their boss. You never know what's going to come out of their mouth. As many of you know, he is a best-selling author whose work on the Clintons was used to get Trump elected. What you might not know is that his work on the Bidens also contributed to Trump's impeachment. He graduated from George Washington and Oxford University, but who really cares? He's on Hannity and Tucker all the time. That seems like a much bigger deal. I mean, that's the bottom line. As humble a guy as he is, Peter's a big deal. He is a #1 New York Times bestselling author who has written over 17 books, which have been translated into 11 languages. His latest book, Profiles in Corruption, offers a deep dive investigation into the private finances and secret deals of some of America's top political leaders, people like Kamala Harris, Joe Biden, and Elizabeth Warren. So I was out doing some digging up on Peter in order to prepare for this introduction, and I ran into one of his personal quotes that was out there on IMDb, of all places. And it says, "To me, Washington, D.C. is a little bit like a professional wrestling. When I was growing up in Seattle, I'd turn on Channel 13, the public access station, and watch wrestling. At first I thought, man, these guys hate each other because they're beating the crap out of each other. But I eventually realized that they're actually more like business partners." Peter has fearlessly reported on that business for over 20 years. That's why they hate him in Washington. But around here, everyone loves him. Amen. Unless you're stuck behind him at a gun show. Please join me in welcoming Peter Schweizer.
Well, thank you very much. I have to say, I've spoken at NEBA numerous times, but it also has a special place in my heart because that's where I first met Catherine and got to know Catherine. And when we were setting up our offices and we needed somebody to actually run the place, I don't run the place, we hired Catherine, and she's done an amazing job for us. So we're very blessed to have her. I was talking to people here earlier, and we were discussing the COVID shadow that has been over us for more than a year. And I imagine that a lot of us probably remember, in the way previous generations might have, the JFK assassination or the attempted assassination on Ronald Reagan, where we were when we realized that COVID was something that was really going to transform the country, that it was going to lead to shutdowns and dramatic changes in the way certain things are being done. There's an individual, though, I want to introduce you to halfway around the world who was at the epicenter of COVID. And this is a doctor. His name was Li Miying. Li Miying, in December 31st, detected that there was a dangerous new virus in China. And concerned about what he was seeing, that people were dying, the intensity and the fact that this spread so quickly, he decided to go onto a WeChat app and communicate with about a dozen of his fellow doctors, where he described what he was seeing, and he told his colleagues, be sure to wear protective gear because this new virus is very dangerous. Now, you would think that most of us, certainly in this country, would see this individual as a hero, but after he sent that message out, the Chinese government's Ministry of State Security rounded him up, and they told Li, you are engaging in anti-state behavior, and you need to sign this confession that you're engaging in anti-state behavior, and if you do it again, you will go to jail. And Li reluctantly signed that document. Within a couple of weeks, he himself had contracted COVID and decided that the Chinese people needed to know what was going on. So he sent out a social media message explaining that there was this new virus that was out there, people needed to be leery of it, and people needed to take precautions. He died less than 24 hours later. That is how the Chinese people actually found out about the COVID-19 virus. Now, the Chinese government and the nature of the Chinese government is something I'm talking about briefly because I want to get to the root of my talk today, which is about the political corruption in the United States involving both political parties and how many of our leaders are engaged in commercial deals and financial deals with the Chinese regime. And I'm going to argue that those relationships are so deep and profound that it prevents us from effectively counteracting what Beijing has planned. Those are pretty stark statements to make. I hope that the information I present will back it up. But suffice it to say that in my mind, and I think based objectively looking around the world, the evil nature of the Chinese regime is hard to dispute. Not only did they go after Dr. Li for simply trying to alert his colleagues about the new virus, remember that they rounded up other doctors who disappeared, who were also working on the heels of COVID. On top of that, you have a regime that has put 1 million Uyghurs in camps. They call them re-education camps. We're talking about a regime that has rounded up Christians, has rounded up followers of Falun Gong, engages in the use of torture and other human rights abuses. But even for those who are not concerned about the nature of the Chinese regime itself, keep in mind that China, under President Xi, has laid out their strategy explicitly and clearly. Their strategy and goal is to surpass the United States as the world's premium power in the world. They want to be number one. So the question is, are we going to take that challenge seriously, and what can we do to counteract that challenge? And those are profound and important questions, but I think before we get to those questions, we have to ask, what is the state of play among our leadership? Imagine there is a sporting event going on, and you have one team that is determined to win this game, and you have another team where the talent may even be greater than the first team, but the entire coaching staff is basically not motivated to win. That they're essentially being paid or being encouraged to throw the game or not take the game as seriously. That's what I would contend is happening today. This is not a conspiracy. This is not treason in the strict literal sense of it. But what it is a deliberate strategy by the Chinese government to pay off political elites in the United States, knowing that by doing so, they are going to be able to counteract the effectiveness of the United States and ultimately supplant them. So what am I talking about? And I'm going to talk about people from both political parties, people that are very prominent on both sides of the aisle. And I'm talking about the very top leadership in this country, beginning with Joe Biden, President of the United States, whose son, Hunter Biden, procured a series of deals while he was vice president with Chinese government-connected entities. And we know that those deals, there was a $1.5 billion private equity deal that he got, even though he had no background in private equity and he had no background in China. We know that he had a company called Rosemont Realty. Of course, he had no background in realty, that was bought by another Chinese state entity called Gemini. We know that he was involved in a series of other partnerships where Chinese state entities came in and bought them for how much money, we don't entirely know. What we know, however, is that most of those deals were secured with the cooperation of individuals in China who have direct links to the Ministry of State Security. And that is not in dispute. So you have a situation where the Chinese leadership has cultivated a commercial relationship with Joe Biden when he was vice president of the United States, and now he is president of the United States. There are probably people in the audience who don't like Joe Biden. But let's not get too self-satisfied, because next let me talk about Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader in the Senate. Mitch McConnell is married to Elaine Chao. Elaine Chao is the transportation secretary in the Trump administration. That family, through Elaine Chao's father, is direct business partners with a Chinese state shipbuilding corporation, which is the largest military contractor in China. Now, did I really say that? Yeah, absolutely I did. You see, Elaine Chao's father has a company called Foremost Shipping. It has offices in Midtown Manhattan. You can actually go to the offices with some work. And if you go into the front office, you see a couple of things. You see an American flag, you see a Chinese flag, People's Republic of China, and you see a pillow on the sofa that says United States Senate. And that picture captures what we are talking about, because Foremost Shipping, which again is the Chow McConnell family, all of their large cargo ships are built by the Chinese State Shipbuilding Corporation. All those ships are financed by the Chinese government. All of those ships are crewed, the crews are provided by the Chinese government. And 90% of the contracts that Mitch MCConnell's family has in the shipping business come courtesy of Chinese state-owned enterprises. And Mitch MCConnell himself is a direct beneficiary. He was given a gift by his father-in-law of $25 million a few years ago. Now, there are people in this audience that probably dislike Mitch MCConnell. But before you get too self-satisfied, let's switch to the other side of the aisle and talk about Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House. Nancy Pelosi, when she first got into Congress in the early 1990s, was vigorously opposed to the Chinese regime. This was around the time of the Tiananmen Square massacre. A lot of people will remember that. And on her first congressional trip to Beijing, China in 1993, she actually smuggled in a banner that denounced the Chinese government for human rights violations, and with a couple of fellow congressmen, she went into the square, unfurled the banner, at which time you can imagine Chinese authorities freaked out, seized the banner, but it made a lot of headlines, and it expressed, I think, accurately her sentiment at that time. But oh, have times changed. And largely because Nancy Pelosi's husband, Paul Pelosi Sr., and her son, Paul Pelosi Jr., have been enormously successful in business. Where? In Beijing, China, over the decades that followed. So her husband sits on the board of a company called Matthews International, which does a series of private equity deals in mainland China. He owns a limousine company that, among other things, was a selected a contractor for the Beijing Olympics. They made a lot of money ferrying around VIPs because of the Beijing Olympics. Her son, Paul Pelosi, is involved with several companies that have massive operations in Beijing, China. And when you talk about Nancy Pelosi's views today, they are decidedly less harsh towards the Chinese government. Now, those are just some, believe me, there are many others, just some of the American political elite who have become wealthy courtesy of the benefit and the largesse of the Chinese government in Beijing. Let me add to that the legions of former senators and congressmen who, once they left the august rotunda of the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C., signed up as lobbyists. But not just lobbyists for any companies, they signed up as lobbyists for Chinese state-owned companies, Chinese military contractors, and even the Chinese government itself. Nancy Pelosi's predecessor as Speaker of the House was a guy named John Boehner. Everybody remembers John Boehner. What did John Boehner do after he left? He signed up with a lobbying firm called Squire Patton Boggs, who for the last 30 plus years has been the premier lobbyist for the Chinese government in Washington, D.C. And on top of that, has at least half a dozen military contractors in China who also hire Squire Patton Boggs to do their work and their bidding in Washington, D.C. So the point of the matter is today, if people are concerned about China and what's going on in China, and if they take the threat for real, that this government is determined to surpass us in manufacturing and industrial capacity by 2025, and to surpass us globally and become the premier superpower by 2049, that's what they tell us they want to be. The question is, what is our leadership going to do about it? And the question in my mind is a big one, because as it stands right now, our political leadership is not incentivized to do much of anything other than coast along and engage in the status quo, because while it might be damaging for the country, it has been enormously benefited for them and for their families. So with that, I want to open this up for questions. I love questions and answers from NEBA. It doesn't have to be on China. This is the current subject of my research, so that's the reason I brought it up. But I'd love to have any thoughts or comments that people have on this subject or many of the other topics that we are facing today. Yes?
Hey, Peter, thank you so much.
Oh, sorry. One of the guys fighting corruption here in the state of Florida. Great to see you.
Thank you for your great work. Really, I think that the question is, first of all, that's very illuminating. We were talking about that here at the table, so it seems rather unpatriotic to say the least, but that's an editorial, but I feel strong about that. My real question is, both political parties seem that the number one goal is to get elected and reelected and stay in power, but doing little or nothing. I mean, it's almost shameful. Not even advancing the principles upon which they ran. And what can we do as the voters, as the constituents, either through organizing ourselves better and being better informed, but acting on that to get them to do what's best, or at least find 2 or 3 issues that are really, really important for the prosperity of our nation and our freedoms. What can we do specifically to make this all about running on and acting on principles, not just on re-election?
I think that's a great question, and I think it's one that a lot of people have pondered and wrestled with. I go back to one that has been around for a while. It doesn't solve everything. We're not going to have any reform that's going to solve all matters, but I do believe profoundly that term limits would have a huge effect in Washington, D.C. We have them here in the state of Florida. You can probably speak to this more than I can. They're not perfect in Florida. One of the criticisms of term limits is that the elected members rely more on their staff, and that's probably true. But in my experience, corruption increases proportionate to the amount of time that elected officials spend in power. It's just one of those iron laws of politics. It does not mean that every elected official who's been in office for 20 years is corrupt. It does not mean that. But it means that a lot of them are, a lot more of them are than somebody who's been there for only 4 years. So term limits to me is a huge part of the problem because there becomes a sense of entitlement that a lot of elected officials get when they've been there for a while, and they get very savvy on these matters of corruption. I mean, if you think of all the individuals that I just talked about, and we could talk about lots of them as it relates to China, in no cases are any of them actually engaging in something illegal. And in fact, none of them themselves are directly taking payment. So my point is they become very sophisticated in figuring out ways to self-enrich. And they become very sophisticated because when they're there for a while, they figure out what is the best route to go and the best pattern to approach it in. So I think term limits would be massively important. It wouldn't solve everything. The second thing I would add to that is we have got to have in this country a focus on the difference between American interests and foreign interests. And what do I mean? Lobbyists, the term lobbying is a dirty word. I don't actually view it that way. I think that lobbying is an opportunity for individuals, companies, labor unions, whatever, to petition their government. Certainly there are corrupt acts that get involved in that, but lobbying in and of itself is not bad. I cannot think of a legitimate reason that we allow foreign governments to hire lobbyists in Washington, D.C., former members of Congress, et cetera, why we allow Chinese military contractors to hire lobbyists in Washington, D.C. to lobby on behalf of their interests. The federal government is not supposed to be representing those entities. They're supposed to be representing American citizens. If you are an American corporation and you have American shareholders and you are, the leadership of your company is American, you have a right to lobby. I don't think you're going to be able to convince me that that should apply to foreign entities. We are unique in that respect, and I think it's a huge, huge problem that we have in this country. The problem is the people that have to make that reform are the people that are getting paid or the people that are hoping to get paid when they leave office. And that's why reforms are so difficult. Elected members of Congress are really one of the few groups of people who get to write their own rules about ethical conduct. And you can imagine why those rules are so loose to begin with. Yes, right here.
Hi, Virginia. Hi, my name is Eric Sager. My question is back to China and maybe foreign policy. Feel free to speak to it. In light of the United States' response to Beijing basically taking over Hong Kong and getting rid of a lot of the principles that was part of that colony, and then Hong Kong and all the freedoms that are now being forfeit, where do you think or project the United States' response will be should China turn its eyes towards Taiwan? There was a noticeable incident a few weeks ago where many Chinese aircraft flew into their airspace. So if you care to speak to that.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Taiwan is a huge problem. Look, my view on this is pretty clear as it relates to Taiwan and everything else. And that is China, to accomplish its goals, to pass us in 2025 in industrial capacity, to pass us in 2049 as a supreme power, they need the help of the United States. What do they need from the United States? Number one, they need access to U.S. capital markets. What do I mean by that? Anybody here, I'm assuming, trading stocks, buying individual stocks, et cetera? You can go right now on the NASDAQ, the New York Stock Exchange, and you can buy shares in large Chinese companies that are wedded at the hip with the Chinese government. And by the way, those Chinese companies listed on the New York Stock Exchange or listed on the NASDAQ do not have to conform to the same accounting principles and transparency rules as any other corporations in the world. Let me say that again. Chinese companies listed on the NASDAQ and the New York Stock Exchange do not need to conform to the same transparency rules or accounting rules as any other company in the world listed on the same exchanges. Because in 2013, they were given an exemption under the Obama administration where they did not have to conform with certain regulatory requirements that other companies did. So what this has led to, of course, is companies like Luckin Coffee and others, Chinese companies listed on the New York Stock Exchange, ended up being absolute frauds. And investors lost a lot of their money. The problem is not that Alibaba or these other large Chinese companies are frauds. It's that they are supporting and advancing the interests of the Chinese state. And my question is, why should we be helping them do that? Why should we be helping them do that? Why should these companies be listed on the premier financial stock exchanges around the world? So the first thing I would say is we should not allow Chinese companies to be listed on American stock exchanges. The second thing we should do is be very clear when it comes to large Wall Street firms. We've been doing a lot of research as it relates to Wall Street firms like BlackRock, Blackstone, and Goldman Sachs, and the kinds of financial transactions they are involved in. Again, with Chinese military contractors, Chinese intelligence contractors, the same thing. Why are American companies providing the needed capital and liquidity that Beijing needs to achieve its goals? I can't think of anybody that can give an effective answer. For decades, the explanation has been, well, we need to engage in China because when we engage in China, they're going to become more like us. The opposite has happened. China was closer to us in 2012 than they are today. They have moved completely in the opposite direction. So to answer your question, we should make sure that they do not have access to American capital markets, I think is number one. And number two, they should not be getting access, the way they are getting access, to American technological capabilities. So what do I mean? Great American companies like Google and Microsoft have set up artificial intelligence research laboratories in China. Who are their partners? Yeah, the Chinese government and Chinese military contractors. Why are American high-tech firms who benefited from the American system, who are protected by American interests overseas, why are they subsidizing China in their technological race against us? Same thing. They should not have access to our financial markets, and we should restrict their access to American technological capabilities. Again, the problem is, somebody over here was making this sign. Part of the problem is money. There's a lot of money that Wall Street, Silicon Valley, and those American politicians make by doing business with Beijing.
Okay, let's be precise with our questions. We got several questions.
All right.
Okay, Jeff Griggs, 2 quick things. One, what all would you advise us to do to combat some of this, getting out information, obviously? And the second thing, more in depth, if you'd be candid, about what you see Biden and Harris administration going forward with all the rumors of the president being totally alert, all this other in transition, if you can share anything.
Yeah, so I think the first thing everybody here needs to do is make clear to their elected officials, meaning congressmen, senators, but even at the state level. I mean, there's been some very interesting stuff the legislature has done, Governor DeSantis has done as it relates to big tech and it relates to China. But let your elected officials know you are concerned about this. I mean, this is, in my mind, an existential threat. China is much more of a threat than the Soviet Union was during the height of the Cold War. The Soviet Union did not have the industrial capacity, did not have the technological capacity that Beijing has. So you need to alert your elected members, and you need to alert people around you as to what's going on. I mean, I've been totally fascinated. I wonder if anybody else has noticed this. We have had this global tragedy of COVID since January of 2020, and we have had discussions about every single aspect of how to cope with it, lockdowns, wearing masks, vaccines. Why is there no national conversation about how this damn thing started in the first place? Right? Because think about it. China, I talked about they locked up the doctors. One of the other things China did, when they learned about COVID-19, they restricted internal travel in China. If you were in Wuhan, you could not leave. If you were from somewhere else, you could not go into Wuhan. They restricted internal travel. Did they restrict international travel going out of Wuhan? No, they did not. They did not. And the New York Times estimated that by the time we found out, some 25,000 airline passengers had traveled from Wuhan to the United States before they did so. So we need to have these kinds of conversations and be thinking about the challenges and threats that we're facing. Because if we don't, we're running in a foot race right now. That's the analogy the Chinese use. This is like a foot race. We're in a foot race, and we don't really feel like we're in a foot race, or we didn't notice we're in a foot race, and they're going to run right past us without us even knowing. I'm sorry, totally forgot the second part of that question.
Biden-Harris.
Oh, Biden-Harris. Yeah, I mean, what I've seen is tougher rhetoric from Joe Biden than he had stated before, but I see no policy differences. And everything that they say related to China when it comes to technology is we need to invest more in U.S. technology. I agree with that. But if you're continuing to subsidize the person running against you, that's just plain stupid. And they do not want to go there because there's too much money to be made. So what I've heard is slightly tougher rhetoric from Joe Biden as it relates to China than we have in the past, but I've seen no changes in policy that indicate anything other than status quo. Yes, Judge.
I'm sorry, Patrick.
Oh, I'm sorry, Patrick. Sorry. I'm sorry.
So we talked about Democrats and Republicans, so let's talk about Trump.
Yep.
Seems to be somewhere in between.
Mm-hmm.
He was going to drain the swamp.
Right.
So we had 4 years of that fight and really exposed the intelligence community. So I'd be interested in your take on the intelligence community and how that was exposed, I guess, in the last 4 years and where it's going from here.
No, it's a great question. And there are people that are part of the swamp that were in the intelligence community and the military brass who play a role in this as well. There's a very powerful consulting firm in Washington, D.C. called Beacon Global Strategies. Beacon Global Strategies was founded by a number of retired senior CIA officials, military officials. Mike Morrell, the former assistant director of the CIA, is involved. There's a whole slew of them. What Beacon Global Strategies does is they get hired by Chinese firms to help get the federal government to approve technology transfer deals. That's how they make their money. Now, they will say, well, no, we're not really getting paid by Chinese firms, and they're not. They're getting paid by American firms who want to sell their technology to China, and they're doing their bidding. And there are several really glaring examples involving chips that Intel and Qualcomm produced, for example, that the Pentagon explicitly said, we cannot sell this fabricating technology to Beijing. It will give them a huge strategic advantage. Beacon Global Strategies went in and assured decision makers, no, this is not going to be a problem. So the deal went ahead, and of course, the worst case scenario applied, and the Chinese got access to what one Air Force general called the crown jewels. So there are lots of people in Washington, D.C., even in the intelligence military sphere, who do this. Bill Cohen, who is a former Secretary of Defense under the Clinton administration, a Republican senator, has the Cohen Group. And they do all kinds of consulting work in China, helping Chinese firms compete against American firms in the developing world. So unfortunately, even in the sphere of people who have pledged an oath to protect the country in this space, they're not doing so. They're selling out for the dollar. And it's a tragedy.
Hold your breath. Dottie's going to be quick.
Thank goodness you already raised the issues of China and how the coronavirus got here. And I'm hoping to hear you tell us in confidence that we won't tell anybody else that your book is going to expose who is responsible for the coronavirus and how it got here, and if it was a whole plot to take down President Trump's great economy and all the programs and bringing jobs back to America.
Well, thank you, Dottie. I have to say I will probably disappoint. I don't know the full story of the origins of the coronavirus, but I absolutely agree with you. It's something that needs to be investigated, and I'm kind of shocked that we do not see more attempts to actually investigate and look into this. I mean, where are the great investigative journalists? This is a cataclysmic crisis that has killed hundreds of thousands of Americans and millions of people around the world, shut down the economy, had all these ramifications. And there just seems to be a complete lack of curiosity about it. So I'm hoping that somebody will. The book that I'm working on now, please keep it in confidence, is on China. And it's on, the working title is Sellout. And it's basically looking at political figures, Wall Street executives, and people in Washington, D.C., who have these sweetheart deals with Beijing. And it's, to say the least, clouding their judgment and leading them to not give us the kind of leadership that we need in this country. So, yes, Judge.
Do you think there's any chance that Hunter Biden's going to be prosecuted for any crimes?
Great question. I am optimistic that there will be more turning there. And the reason I say that is for a couple of reasons. First of all, as you all know, there's a grand jury that was convened in 2018 to look into Hunter Biden. That grand jury is still, now almost 3 years later, still working through the information. And we took great pride in the fact that we first exposed Hunter Biden's China deals in January of 2018. So the grand jury came about 6 months after we first exposed them. Nobody knew about Hunter's China deals until we exposed them. The grand jury is looking at a series of issues, but I think the most interesting and compelling is they are looking at money laundering and they are looking at tax fraud related issues. Because we now know that there are tens of millions of dollars. This came from Senator Johnson's report, U.S. Senate Oversight Committee report, that Hunter Biden took in tens of millions of dollars from Chinese-connected entities and for some reason didn't feel he needed to declare taxes on some of those. But there's also the larger issue of money laundering, which is, there are these things called suspicious activity reports, or SARs, that our Treasury Department flags. If I'm sitting here in Tallahassee, and this never happens, and I get $3.5 million from a corrupt oligarch in Ukraine, wired to my bank account, that's going to get flagged by the Treasury Department. And the bank that I have, let's say it's Wells Fargo or Capital City, They need to launch an internal investigation to determine the origins of those funds and whether those funds might be connected to criminal activity. And then if the bank has to file a report with the Treasury Department on that matter. In the case of Hunter Biden, that we know of, there were 43 SARs filed by the Treasury Department. This is during the Obama administration on financial transactions involving Hunter Biden. That's not a good sign. There are also rumors, I will say rumors, although I think it's pretty clear that there are individuals at Morgan Stanley. Morgan Stanley was Hunter Biden's financial institution that have declared whistleblower status, that apparently know something about those. They were in the compliance department, and the whistleblower laws mean, of course, that if you expose or reveal, say, $30 million in criminal behavior, you actually get a financial reward for that. So there are some motivated individuals at Morgan Stanley. So I believe that these are going to have some sort of a cumulative effect, and my hope and faith in the American judicial system is such that I want to believe that this stuff is not simply going to be swept under the rug. I know there are people here that are skeptics, but please, I've got to believe that something like this is going to see the light of day and warrant serious investigation and prosecution. Terry.
Eric Swalwell, has your research gotten into his situation with the Chinese spy girlfriend?
Yes.
Tell us.
Yes. Eric Swalwell is an absolutely fascinating case. As you guys know, he's the one that had a relationship. It's unclear what that relationship is, although it's actually pretty clear because he has not denied that they didn't have a sexual relationship with a lady who is linked to Chinese intelligence. And that occurred at the time that he was on the House Intelligence Committee. I will say in my research also, there's a lot of similar concerns involving Senator Dianne Feinstein from California. She was the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee for a decade, and during that period, her husband, Richard Blum, had a series of deals with the Chinese government that also make her very concerning, especially in light of some of the public statements she's made. So yes, Eric Swalwell is absolutely something that needs to be looked at, and the suggestion by the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, that there's nothing to see here, we can move on, is absolutely stunning to me. You don't have a right to serve on the Intelligence Committee. There's a very vigorous process that you go through to determine which elected officials serve on those committees, because you are given access to the most sensitive intelligence information that we have as a country. And the fact that, out of 220 members of Congress, you can't find one who didn't sleep with a Chinese spy to sit on the House Intelligence Committee is pretty stunning to me. So yes, that's very, very disconcerting, and is further evidence to me that a lot of people in Washington high levels are not taking the Chinese threat as seriously as they should. It's a great
Peter
point.
Rocky has a question.
Yes.
Peter, many of us, most of us, are an age that we remember starting about the 5th grade. We began our civics classes, and one of the first things we learned was where monies got and appropriations got started in the Ways and Means Committee and the House of Representatives. At what point do we get back to the budget process? And I know Dominic's probably got an answer for this, but at what point do we get back to looking at it? Hell, we don't even look at it. When are we going to start this process over again?
It's a great question. Actually, somebody bring Dominic a microphone, because I do want you to chime in on this. I mean, this is much more in your wheelhouse than mine. No, I think, look, the problem is that with so many of these issues, although both sides will scream about it, they scream about the debt, they scream about the deficit, they scream about the broken process, it serves their interests, right? I mean, let's face it, I believe that deficits matter and the debt matters. A lot of Republicans say that they do, but when it actually comes to voting, they don't. Or they vote for continuing resolutions to sort of put spending on autopilot And of course, the Democrats, to be balanced here, the Democrats suddenly worry about deficits when it's a Republican president, but they don't when it's their own. So the problem here is it's a pox on both of their houses, and it serves their interests, and they're going to keep doing this until the American people say that it's unacceptable. The question is, do we view it as unacceptable? I think a lot of people in this room do. Unfortunately, there are a lot of people out in the country who are happy as long as they're getting their government program or their government check. They don't care what the process looks like, even though we should. But Dominic, I'm sure you have probably something more substantive than that.
You had so much to add, Peter. I think the one thing I would really love to see is a balanced budget requirement, a meaningful one, not super
Amen.
strict, but something that says that unless it's something extraordinary, require 3/5 or some extraordinary supermajority of the Congress or an act of war, something that really necessitates that lack of fiscal stewardship and discipline.
Yep.
We have to live within our means, and that really deficits, particularly $20 trillion deficit. We don't have to eliminate it, but we can't have equal to or greater than a gross domestic product or
Right.
gross national product, and it is. And it's just, we're going to be subject to China and other foreign governments, which we owe money. When they start claiming that, okay, and then ultimately it's going to affect currency. Right now, the American currency, the dollar is the currency of preference and choice. And when that's not the case, I'm telling you folks, we have no idea the consequences it's going to have on our banking, our finances, our cost of living. It's unbelievable, and it's not that far away.
Yeah.
I don't want to be a Debbie Downer, but it's really serious. Like deficits and lack of fiscal discipline. Rocky, as you said, we learned as kids. Mom and Dad told us, live within your means. If we don't, serious consequences. Thanks, Peter.
Yep. Excellent.
One last one.
One last question.
You have to wait for a microphone.
Here's one.
I've got one right here. That's
Yeah.
Sorry. My question is, as you were talking and saying that we need to go ahead and get the word out, part of the issue with that is that the mainstream media is completely going against all of that. And
Oh, yeah.
so many people don't watch any other news programs. They don't go out for alternative news sources. So having a conversation, if you're trying to sit down and have that conversation with someone, it creates an incredible divide, and it's causing all sorts of strife. And
Yeah.
that's one of them. And then the other thing is the Great Reset and how's that going to affect it? Sorry.
No, great point. No, I think the media is a huge problem, and look, I'm somebody who has done a lot of work with the mainstream media over the years, the New York Times, 60 Minutes, and others. The media has really changed in the last 5 or 6 years. I don't think it was directly caused by Trump per se, but I think it was an opportunity for the media to essentially say, we're no longer going to sort of try to report in a balanced way. They basically proclaim themselves, the New York Times did this, say we are now part of the resistance. In other words, we are now an active participant in the political process. And once they have claimed that, they ain't going to give it up. Because it's a lot more fun feeling like you're on some sort of messianic mission to save democracy. What was the Washington Post slogan? Democracy dies in darkness. I mean, come on. That is much more appealing for a young journalist than to say you're going to give a balanced story to inform people as best you can as to what's going on in situations. So the media is not going to change. I think that is going to be ultimately to their demise, because I think you're right. They cover up a lot of things, but what happens is I still have enough faith that there are people out there that are paying attention, and they wonder why certain things don't get covered. I have a friend who, did not like Donald Trump, voted for Joe Biden, but was furious that the media would not cover the Hunter Biden stuff. Was furious. He said, this is ridiculous. He said, I'm not worried about it because I still think Biden's a better choice, but this is ridiculous that voters don't even know about it. And there was actually some work done by a media research center. They hired a pollster, and they found that if Biden voters had known about Hunter Biden's dealings, that he probably would have lost about 10% of his vote. So yes, the bottom line is the media is a huge problem. I believe, maybe naively, that truth wins out in the end. And that what we need to do is focus on being truthful, being fact-driven, revealing things to people, and I believe still in the good common sense and good nature of the American people, and I'm never going to lose that. And part of that confidence comes from groups like this. It's really great to see everybody, a lot of familiar faces. Glad we all made it through COVID, and look forward to coming back to NEBA sometime in the future. Thank you very much.